Hello everyone, Jolene here from Bookworm Adventure Girl. Welcome back. I hope that you are all well. And if you are new, thanks for checking out my channel. Please hit subscribe and stick around. Today I am going to be talking about all of the books I finished in February. I read a total of 14 books in February, which is consistent with how many I read in January, but I didn't have as many 5-star reads as I did in January. I think that was an anomaly, actually, but I did read some really good books. There are some books that I'm not going to go into any great detail in this video because I will be talking about them later in the month or early in April. So for the reading project that I'm doing with AJ from AJ Dunn Reads and Writes, we are doing the Tuesdays with Toni series, and we are reading all of Toni Morrison's novels throughout this year. I will leave a link to that playlist in the description box below so you can go and check that out, and you can also go and check out AJ's channel. So I read Sula in February, but I will be doing an entire video on Sula, and that will be next Tuesday, and AJ will have their video up as well. So I'm not going to really say more about this at this point. And then for the Booktube Prize, I read 2 books. I'm reading in the fiction category, and I read French Braid by Anne Tyler, and I also read Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. So I'm not allowed to talk about these yet, and that means that I have, half of the books left in my particular group because I've already read Young Mungo by Douglas Stuart. So I have 3 more to go. But I can't talk about them, but what I will do is in early April, I will do an entire video just on the Booktube Prize books that I read, and I will tell you my rankings and what I thought about them. And I will also leave a link to Robert's video below explaining all about the Booktube Prize, what it is, and showing the books in all of the different categories for this round. This is the octafinals round. So then for Canada Reads, which will be having their debates at the end of the month, I read Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. And that leaves me with 2 more books to read for before the debates, and I am going to do I'm hoping to do a winner prediction video just before those debates take place. So I am going to talk about Mexican Gothic and the other 4 books at that time and hopefully choose the winner. If you aren't sure what Canada Reads is, I will leave a link to that playlist in the description box below as well. So that leaves 10 more books to talk about, and I'm going to stick with Canada Reads because I read one of the long listed books, and it starts like this. Here are the rules. This is a single person podcast, and this is from Hana Carries On by Uzma Jalaluddin. This is the author's 2nd novel, but it's the first one that I read, and this was kind of like a modern day Muslim take on You've Got Mail. And I love that movie, but I didn't really love this book. It was okay. I'm glad I read it, and I have another book on my shelf by Uzma Jalaluddin that I'm willing to give a try. She also has a new book coming out later this year as well. So what I liked about this book was the setup. Hana has this online personality as a podcaster, and she has rules around that and doesn't want to blur the lines with other parts of her life. But there is one commenter who becomes more friendly. And Hana's family runs a halal restaurant that she also helps out with. And there are conflicts and tensions when another halal restaurant opens up in the neighborhood. So this is, much like Joe Fox opening up his big bookstore in You've Got Mail. So I liked that it brought in the cultural elements of a regular Muslim family, and it brought up the issues that Muslims often face in Canadian culture and society. So that felt real. What I wasn't fussy for was the romance storyline. It didn't feel realistic to me. and the build up and arc that exists a bit in You've Got Mail, it fell very flat for me in this book. So I'm glad I read this, but this is not a story that will stick with me. So if you are interested in a Muslim twist on You've Got Mail, you might want to try this. So also sticking with the Canadian theme, the book that I read for the Reading Across Canada Challenge begins. I remember wanting to escape the year 2016 like a kid in a haunted house, dashing from whatever real or imagined demon was chasing me. And this is the first line from The Skin We're In by Desmond Cole. So for the Reading Across Canada Challenge, which again I will leave a link to that playlist below in case you don't know what it is that I'm talking about. So for the month of February, we were to choose a book by an author from or living in Alberta, or a book set in Alberta. And Desmond Cole was born in Red Deer, Alberta, between Calgary and Edmonton. And the prompt, if you choose to follow the prompt, was to read a book on a topic that you are passionate about. And I thought, well, because it's February and it's Black History Month, I thought that I would take the opportunity to read a book by a Black Canadian author that is about the experience of being Black in Canada. So this was such a good book for that, and I loved how Desmond Cole approached it. So the structure was that each chapter was a month in the year 2017. So this is before George Floyd and other situations like that, and yet it is about situations just like that, that were and are often still overlooked. It was an interesting reading this book in light of all of that. So each month focused on events that actually happened that month in the year 2017, and it took on different themes. So the police involvement being one of them, carding, the Indigenous perspective, and other things that Desmond, his friends, and Black people experience every day in Canada. So I think that Desmond Cole does such a good job at asking certain questions to really make you think and to give you a new perspective. And, you know, there were a few times where I had to stop and just think how I am part of this. I grew up in this Canadian culture, and how do I think of these things? How have I been influenced? And a lot of times, you know, Canadians think that we don't have the same issues as, say, in the US, for example, or that slavery wasn't a big deal in Canada, or that we are so much better than other people in other places. And, you know, Desmond Cole addresses that attitude and all of that and that thinking, and shows us that we do have problems in Canada, that we are not blameless, and that we still have a long way to go. So I think that this book is a really important book for everyone, really, but especially for Canadians. So sticking with the Reading Across Canada Challenge, I also read my book for March, and it begins, I was born at Whitefish Lake on what is now called the Big River First Nation. And this is from Call Me Indian by Fred Sasakamoose. This was my book for Saskatchewan, and it's a memoir which follows the prompt for March, and I'm actually going to be talking about this more probably in my next video, which will be out in a couple of days, and I will be doing my Reading Across Canada video. So for now, I will just say that this is one of my favorite memoirs by an Indigenous author, and it got an easy 5 stars. So the next 2 books I kind of read as a pairing. The first book is a classic that begins. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. And this, of course, is from Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This is only my second book by Virginia Woolf, and I enjoyed it. If you enjoy books with a lot of action and movement and with characters that you can easily fall in love with, then this is definitely not the book for you. This is very much a character-driven novel. It's slow. It's stream of consciousness writing, and it takes place over one day. And I tend to like books that, can tell a story over a short period of time, and I do like character-driven novels. In this story, which is set in London, England, Clarissa Dalloway is preparing for a party that she's having that evening. And as she sets out to buy these flowers that we hear about, we are in her thoughts. She remembers past moments in her life. And we meet the people that she meets on her flower buying errand. And in one of the first memories, if not the first memory, there is foreshadowing that something bad is going to happen. So the themes in this book were also interesting to me. Themes of mortality, death, and the role of women. In this case, Clarissa reflects on her own mortality and death in general, as do other characters, and she is completely aware that she is defined by being her husband's wife. And I was surprised that Woolf included lesbian relationships. So Clarissa herself has been in love with her friend Sally since they were much younger. And I wonder how that was taken at the time that this book was written, along with the theme of mental illness, which is also a really big one for this story. So it does get a little confusing sometimes, like who the story is being told by at a particular time. So it goes back and forth from the present to the past. There's a lot going on, and it's more about the themes, I think, than it is about getting to know the characters or the character development. And I was especially interested in reading Mrs. Dalloway at this time because I was doing a buddy read with Michael from Michael Romeo Talks Books. And that book begins, "She hurries from the house wearing a coat too heavy for the weather." And this is from The Hours by Michael Cunningham. This is a retelling of Mrs. Dalloway. I have seen the movie. I know that Michael didn't like this book as much as I did. And I think that had I not read Mrs. Dalloway at the same time, or at least beforehand, I wouldn't have liked it as much either. But it was really neat to compare the two stories. What I liked about this book was that it tells the story of 3 women in 3 different timelines. So the first is Virginia Woolf herself, and then the second is her main character, Clarissa Dalloway, and the third is Laura Brown. And this book was a little easier for me to follow along, like which story was being told, and in this case, the stories or the characters kind of connect at the end. So this begins with Woolf's suicide, and then we follow Mrs. Dalloway's story, which is changed a bit. So for example, the Richard in this story is not her husband as it is in Woolf's story, but is her friend that she's throwing a party for, and he is dying of AIDS. And then the third storyline is Laura Brown, who is the housewife and mother, and she is reading Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. So I liked how these 3 storylines are connected and brought together. And of course the same themes from Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway are captured in The Hours as well. So mental illness, suicide, mortality, death, and time. And there are some significant moments in this story. It's a character-driven story, just like Mrs. Dalloway, but also like Mrs. Dalloway, I never really connected to the characters. So both of these books I think are worth a read if you are okay with slower paced, character-driven novels and stream of consciousness writing. So I would say that I like The Hours a bit more because I like how it's more complex and it's layered, but you may also need to read Mrs. Dalloway to really understand that. The next book I read begins back in 1961 when women wore short waist dresses and joined garden clubs and drove legions of children around in seat-beltless cars without giving it a second thought, back before anyone knew there'd even be a 60s movement, much less one that its participants would spend the next 60 years chronicling. Back when the big wars were over and the secret wars had just begun, and people were starting to think fresh and believe everything was possible. The 30-year-old mother of Madeline Zott rose before dawn every morning and felt certain of just one thing: her life was over. So this is from Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. I was really excited to read this book. I love this edition. I definitely like the cover better than the US edition, and I love that there's sprayed edges and the periodic table is on the edges. So the marketing for this is incredible. For a debut novel, I thought that this was great. The story takes place in the 50s and 60s. Elizabeth Zott is a chemist, and for the time period, she's not your typical woman. She isn't looking for a husband, and she doesn't really care for the domestic life. She's mostly interested in her work as a scientist, and she takes that very seriously. And she has to fight to be acknowledged in a man's world. So the story starts off when we know that Elizabeth has a daughter. And then it goes back in time to show how she got to where she is. So I liked Elizabeth's character, and seeing how the themes of women in the workplace, women in science, roles of women, and marriage and motherhood were all brought into the story through her. I really like the idea of her bringing chemistry to women all over through a cooking show. And the author also used some of her own experiences, like she's a rower and Elizabeth begins rowing. So I didn't love this book as much as I thought I would, but I did really enjoy it. I would definitely read more from this author, and they are making a series. I think it's with Apple TV for this book, so I would definitely be interested in that. So this is a great book if you like strong female protagonists, if you like feminist themes, and if you like debut novels. I do think that Bonnie Garmus is an author to really watch for. The next book that I read is a mystery, and it begins. It's a widely known fact that most moms are ready to kill someone by 8:30 a.m. on any given morning. So this is from Finlay Donovan is Killing It by Elle Cosimano. I really enjoyed this book. It was funny, there was a mystery, and it was just a quick and easy read. Finlay Donovan is a writer. She's separated from her husband, and she is a mother. And she's behind in the book that she's writing. And when she meets with her publisher, someone overhears their conversation in the restaurant and completely misunderstands it. And they think that Finlay Donovan is a hitman, or in this case, a hitwoman. And they offer to pay her a lot of money to kill their husband. So the thing is, it's an entertaining, misunderstanding. But Finlay is also behind in her bills, and she can really use the money. So she actually finds herself investigating the husband, and it turns out he's a creep. And during her time investigating more, things happen that put her right in the middle of everything and the mystery. So I enjoyed the secondary characters too, especially the kid's babysitter and how she gets involved. So I just thought that this was fun and clever. I have the next book in the series that I'm hoping to get to soon. And the third book in the series, I think, has already come out this year. It came out earlier this year. So I think that this might be a series that I will read and I'll follow. It reminds me a little bit of Stephanie Plum. It's that type of book. So if you like those mysteries, then you might like this as well. So this is good if you are, looking for a mystery that is also funny and with a female lead character. The next book I read is also from a series, and it begins. I saw Lila for the last time 5 years ago in the winter of 2005. And this is from Those Who Leave and Those Who Stay by Elena Ferrante. This is the third book in the Neapolitan series, and these are really hard to talk about further into the series because I don't want to, give anything away. I don't want to give out spoilers. But this continues the friendship between Lila and Elena and how their lives have gone in completely different directions. Elena is pursuing a career and has become a writer, and she has to deal with some of the consequences to that in this. Lila has continued working, even though things in her life have changed as well. So the friendship between these two women remains very complex, in my opinion. The tension between the two is still very much present. And yet, as always, there is something between them that continues to draw them back together time and time again, and they actually need one another. So I'm still really impressed by Ferrante's writing. I want to see how this story comes together in the final book, because it is unlike anything else I've ever read. The story is dark. The friendship of the two women, even though it's layered, it has jealousy and resentment and a deep bond of understanding and dependency in a way. All of this with the backdrop of the political situation and their neighborhood as well. So I'm anxious to read the final book, and I would also like to see kind of what Ferrante's writing is like with her standalone book. So I think I will definitely be reading more. This book is good if you have already read the first two books in the series, and if you are already enjoying that, and if you're interested in that series, then I highly recommend starting with the first book. Next up is a memoir that begins like this. On the path ahead, stepping out from behind a boulder, a man appears. And this is from I Am, 17 Brushes with Death by Maggie O'Farrell. So I've been wanting to read a Maggie O'Farrell book because I've only been hearing really good things about Hamnet and The Marriage Portrait, but this is the book that I've had on my shelf. So I wanted to get to it first before I got more books. So this is a really interesting way to look at one's life. Maggie O'Farrell shares 17 instances in her life when she was either close to death or near death in some way. So my first thought was, that's a lot, right? 17. But these aren't near-death experiences in the way that I originally thought they might be. Rather, there are times when she experienced the closeness of death, either for herself or a loved one, like her daughter. So, for example, she talks about a childhood illness, an encounter with a man who turned out to be a murderer, an experience traveling in a plane. So there are different things like that. So these stories are told almost like vignettes. So each chapter being one of these experiences. And sometimes she connects them back to previous experiences as well. So I really liked the idea of this, and for the most part found the different stories to be really interesting. What I thought was strange is that the stories are not told in chronological order. There doesn't seem to be, at least not that I could figure out, there doesn't seem to be a reason for their order, which I thought was kind of strange. And they are also told in a way that sometimes it feels like Maggie O'Farrell could be talking about anyone, and she even reminds the reader a few times, like saying, this person is me. And I thought it was a little weird. Why not just write the story from your perspective the whole way through and own it? So that was odd. What I did like was that many of the stories are really compelling, and it made me think of my own life and my own experiences of being close to death. And it turns out that there are, more of those experiences than I would have originally thought. So looking at our lives through that lens, I think, is interesting. And I think in Maggie O'Farrell's case, it would have been even more successful if it didn't feel like she was kind of still at arm's length. So all that being said, I'm really looking forward to reading more of her work and her fiction, and I did appreciate a bit of the insight from this book that let me know a little bit more about her and who she is, and I think that this is a good book if you like memoirs, kind of snapshots of people's life, and if you're looking to learn more about Maggie O'Farrell. The final book that I want to talk about begins like this. Hi, my name is Matthew, although you may know me by another name. My friends call me Maddie, and I should be dead. This is from Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing by Matthew Perry. So this book is getting a lot of buzz, a lot of attention, and I thought that I would try it. I've heard people who love this book, and there's also been some reviews where people have either DNF'd it or they didn't care for it at all. So I wanted to read it to see where I fell on the enjoyability spectrum. So let me start with what I liked. I appreciated that I did learn some new things about Matthew Perry. Somewhere along the line, I have to admit that I forgot that he was Canadian, and I hadn't realized who his parents were, and it turns out that I know them. Like, I don't know them personally, but from TV and Canadian politics, I know them. So it was neat, knowing the places that he talked about in the book, and I could easily imagine his life in Canada. And then I also didn't know about his tennis background and how he ended up in LA in the first place. So if nothing else, I learned more about Matthew Perry. Probably, like most people, I know Matthew Perry mostly from watching Friends. I've always enjoyed the show. I've been a fan. I would consider myself a fan, probably from the beginning. And the title of the book basically tells you what the book is about. So Friends, meaning both the show and his role as Chandler, and how he and Chandler are similar in many ways. And Matthew also talks about friends who have supported him along the way. And then Lovers, so he talks about several of his relationships, including dating Julia Roberts, and he talks about how he has struggled in relationships. And then The Big Terrible Thing, which I don't think is a surprise to anyone, this is his addiction to drugs and alcohol. So here's what I didn't like. First of all, Matthew Perry reminds us many times in the story who he is, how rich he is, and how successful he has been. So my first question is, how was this so poorly edited? If you have the money to have the best editor, then why is this book so repetitive, like word for word in many parts? That was unbelievably annoying to me. It was unnecessary and kind of insulting as a reader. The second thing is that I found this to be probably the most narcissistic memoir I have ever read. There were also times that I'm sure were meant to be funny, but it just didn't work. And although, it's obvious, and Matthew Perry even admits this himself, that he uses humor to deflect and to cope, some of the humor just didn't work in memoir format for me. Again, I think a good editor could have helped with that. So this didn't make me dislike Matthew Perry or anything, but it didn't really make me like him more either. I'm glad I read the book so that I could, make up my own mind and make a conclusion myself. I'm glad I didn't purchase the book, and I'm going to take it for what it is, which is a memoir about a celebrity. If you are a Friends fan and you want to read about Matthew Perry, then check this out. If you're not a fan, then I don't think that you're really missing much here. So I found it a bit disappointing, to say the least. So those are the books that I read in February. As I said, The books I didn't talk about today, I will be talking about soon, some of them in my next few videos, and I will leave links below to all of the different challenges and reading projects that I mentioned. But please let me know if you have read any of these books, or if you are interested in reading any of these books, if any of them sound good to you. And then let me know what books you enjoyed reading the most in February. Were there any that you loved, any that you found disappointing to you? I'd love to hear all about that, and I look forward to chatting with you in the comments. As always, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and don't forget to make every day an adventure.